This is a production of Cornell University.
It's an honor to be here, and I'm excited to talk about gene editing, because that's sort of the new technology, the next step in genomics, in biology, and in agriculture. But the question is, what is the regulatory pathway for those products, and what's the consumer pathway for consumer acceptance of those products? And I don't think I'm going to give you all the answers today. I'm going to provide you hopefully with some new information about what's going on around the world on those topics, and I'll give you some of my thoughts about where I think things need to go, and predicts therefore a little bit of where I think it will go in the future. But hopefully provide you some different ways to think about these topics as you go forward in a lot of the work that's done here at Cornell and at TALENS in particular. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. I am going to set the stage a little bit, just what is gene editing, what are the different applications of gene editing for those of you who don't know as much about that. Then I'm going to spend a lot of time on the regulatory situation, both in the US and other parts of the world, give my thoughts on where that should move forward, and then talk about consumer acceptance and transparency of products of this technology with some final thoughts. So what is gene editing? What are we talking about when we talk about gene editing? And genome editing is really the ability to make specific genetic changes within the organism's genome, where we can identify a specific location and then identify a specific kind of alteration we might want in that location in the genome. It could be an insertion of DNA, it could be deletion, a point mutation, an allelic swap. And it really does take advantage of the natural process of errors in normal DNA repair system. So there are a number of different tools, gene editing tools, that are used to gene edit a genome. We have zinc finger nucleases, meganucleases, TALENS, CRISPRs, which I put in red because that's the one that everybody seems to talk about these days, the easiest to do, the sort of the one that's the best today. But I also put down at the end of the slide, and there are others, and there will be others in the future. I think if I give this talk 5 years from now, there probably will be 1 or 2 other gene editing tools that have been added to that toolbox. So as a lawyer, as a regulator, one has to think about, we're not just going to do it for CRISPR, but whatever we're going to do, we have to realize that the science is going to keep evolving, that it's going to keep changing, and how do we address that? And so I really wanted to point that out, that this is an evolving science. And I also wanted to point out just a little bit about what gets done, because what gets done helps us think about how consumers might accept it and what regulators might do, what laws might apply. So this is my one slide that I stole from somebody to talk about sort of how gene editing is. So we look at the green part of the DNA here. This is the part of the DNA we want to edit. So we set up an RNA molecule that has that same base pair, analogous base pair associated with it. We add the enzyme that cuts to that. We take that complex, put it into the cell. It finds the DNA match, and it goes and cuts. And at that point, we either let normal repair mechanisms occur, which might lead to a point mutation, a silencing of that gene, or we could add DNA at that point. We could also put in a specific piece of DNA that we want to introduce, which could be a whole new gene, or it could be a portion of a gene, or a promoter, whatever we want to introduce at that stage in the genome. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about gene editing. And I want to mention that not all gene editing is the same. And that I think is very important for the discussion we're going to have. So we could add a gene from the same organism from a different organism with gene editing tools. We could add a few nucleotides in one location or in multiple locations, or we could even delete a few nucleotides in one location or multiple locations, or a huge amount of the genome. Delete hundreds of base pairs or thousands of base pairs if we want to. So not all gene editing is the same, but when we hear the discussion around the regulation of it, a lot of times there is this sort of thought that it's all one thing, that everybody's doing the same thing, but that's not the case. Finally, I just want to sort of put this in context. So gene editing may be the most recent way to alter plants and animals in agriculture, but scientists have been using a lot of different techniques to modify plants and to change the genomes of plants for traits that are valuable to agriculture. And this slide sort of just sets forth a number of those different things, genome editing being one of those. When I think about these, I've done a really bad job in this slide of sort of conveying that these things are a continuum. But when you look at all these techniques now, they've gotten to the point where they all blur together. It's no longer able to think about them on a straight line continuum to some extent. So here we have different kinds of gene editing techniques, different kinds of things. We have more classical things like chemical or radiation mutagenesis. We have genetic engineering, GMOs and transgenics. We have some of the different gene editing things. But I put them on which of these are more controllable or less controllable. We can do gene silencing with this, but we also can do it with this. We can add a gene with these techniques, but we can also add it with this technique. So these things begin to mold together on a continuum, and they begin to sort of begin to differentiate, which as a lawyer becomes difficult because laws and regulations like to have bright line definitions, and it's very hard to have a bright line definition anymore. Recently the World Economic Forum came out with a white paper on bioinnovation, and I just wanted to quote a couple of words from this, which talk about this idea. They talk about gene editing, and they say, the degree of intervention makes up a more continuous spectrum, determining low versus high levels of genetic alteration, natural versus artificial outcomes, or low versus high risk cases is becoming a question of judgment on a continuous spectrum. Therefore, depending on the type of graduated change in an organism's genome, gene editing could produce a product identical to one created with traditional mutagenesis, or a product identical to a transgenic GMO. No longer are there clear directions for transgenic methods, conventional methods, biotechnology, and other methods, and so forth and so on. I think that really captures this idea that these things are all blending together to some extent, and you can't make those big distinctions. So with that, I want to briefly just talk about some of the applications that are out there, so everybody in the room has sort of a common understanding. So we have lots of things in the pipeline on the plant side, things like high oleic soybeans through gene editing from a company like TALENS, a high fiber wheat, also from TALENS. We have lower saturated canola oil. We have scientists working on citrus greening, citrus fruit resistant to citrus greening disease using CRISPR. We have scientists working on cassava resistant to brown streak virus using this. So we're talking about crops that are used in the United States, also used in developing countries. People trying to prevent chocolate from extinction using CRISPR. So a number of things on the plant side. And similarly, we have things on the animal side. The hornless cattle is the one that I think gets the most press out there, taking the allele from dairy cattle, from Angus cattle that are normally hornless and trying to put that into dairy cattle. And so that's an example out there. We have one CRISPR that was done to produce a lower fat pig. And we have also swine resistant to 14 reproductive and respiratory syndrome virus. So a number of things, and I could have put up 40 more slides for things that are all in the pipeline. The question with all these becomes, a lot of these are proof of concept. Which of these will actually make it to market? Which of these will actually be products out there? So with that background, I wanted to now get into sort of the regulation of gene-edited agricultural products. And sort of what I'm going to talk about now is sort of what is the current regulatory situation in both the US and in other countries. But to preface that, I look at this regulatory debate that goes on as a light switch. And most of the debate that's going on is the question is the gene-edited product a GMO, in which case it's regulated, the light switch is on, or is it not a GMO, in which case the light switch is off, and it's not regulated. And that is, if I have to characterize the debate that's going on around the world, that's the debate that's happening. So far, the answer to that is unclear. Okay, in most countries, it's pretty still unclear what that is. And clearly, if we look at all the 200 countries around the world, if there's not a clear pick of things, the light switch being on or the light switch being off. So with that preface, what's the story in the US regulatory system? And the takeaway from the US regulatory system is currently it treats gene-edited products the same as a GMO. Okay, and I'm going to repeat that. It treats gene-edited products the same as a GMO, and now I'm going to explain to you why. Okay, from a legal perspective. So in order to do that, you have to have a little understanding of what the regulatory system is in the United States for GMOs. So U.S. regulates genetically engineered crops under the Plant Protection Act. And I don't expect everybody to know all this or understand all this, but the Plant Protection Act is how they regulate them. And what they've historically said was, you can't release a genetically engineered crop into the environment without getting a permit from USDA under the Plant Protection Act. And eventually you deregulate that so that farmers can grow it and nobody needs permits anymore. Their trigger, their legal trigger, what the law is protecting is plant pests. So the law is trying to protect the environment, agricultural environment, from introduction of plant pests into the environment. And so the trigger has been that a GM crop could be a potential plant pest and therefore it needed to be regulated. And primarily that was based on the fact that the transformation vehicle, the way you got the new gene into the plant, that new trait that was engineered, was through agrobacterium. And agrobacterium is a listed plant pest. Okay, agrobacterium infects plants and causes disease in them. And so that was the traditional way that they got the regulation. So I can sit here today and say before 2010, all genetically engineered crops were regulated. If you had a genetically engineered crop in the United States, you would do research at a place like Cornell. You couldn't do that research outside of the laboratory without getting a permit from USDA. After 2010, it depends. Not all GMOs or genetically engineered crops, or genetically modified crops, whatever we want to call them, are currently regulated at USDA. If you use agrobacterium as your transformation method, you are regulated. But if you use the gene gun, you're not regulated because the gene gun ballistically pushes that DNA into the cell, and you're not using a plant pest. So, contrary to what people think, that all GMOs are regulated in the United States, like I say, that's not the case. And here's an example. So there's a transgenic sorghum that's being developed by Ceres, a biotech company, and they went to USDA and said, you know, we introduced a foreign gene, a gene from a different species, into our sorghum. Are we regulated? And the USDA said in a letter back to them, you didn't use any plant pests in your construct or in your method of transformation, so you are not regulated. And there are a number of other, I could have put other examples up there. None of them are commercial products yet, as far as I'm aware of, but there are other things in the pipeline that USDA has said won't be regulated. So one of your takeaways is not all GMOs are regulated in the United States by USDA. Similarly, researchers who are developing gene-edited crops have also gone to USDA and said, am I regulated? So the non-browning mushroom, probably one of the most popular ones, got a lot of popular press, used CRISPR, Penn State researcher used CRISPR to make it non-browning, to silence a gene, and USDA said you didn't use any plant pests in the process. CRISPR itself, the CRISPR molecule, is not a plant pest, and so we're not going to regulate it. And similarly, they said that for, here's a camelina oil that was used, CRISPR-Cas9 was used with that. And again, I could put up probably a couple dozen of these that have gone through this am I regulated process at USDA and said that they're not regulated. So you'd say, well, and as far as I know, they've not said that any gene editing crop you are regulated yet, in fact. So Secretary Perdue made a statement earlier this year where he said, and this is from the press release, U.S. does not regulate or have any plans to regulate plants that could otherwise have been developed through traditional breeding techniques, as long as they are not plant pests or developed using plant pests. So, and he gives the example of genome editing. So he specifically says, sort of memorializes what USDA had been doing, saying as long as it's, as long as there's no plant pest involved, it's not going to be regulated. And they then went on to talk about things that could be included, would be deletions, single base pairs, and so forth and so on. But again, they also have this caveat that were developed, that could be developed through traditional breeding techniques, which they didn't define. So, so that's the current regulatory system in USDA. FDA also regulates genetically engineered or all our foods, and they currently have a voluntary consultation process for genetically engineered plants, where they look at the genetically engineered plant and compare it to its conventional counterpart and ask whether they're substantially equivalent. And to date, there's no reason not to believe that every single developer and every single that's out there has been through that voluntary process. And that was what the government has proposed, the same thing for gene-edited crops, saying you're not required to come in, but you could come in, and we're happy to look at safety data associated with it and see that the gene-edited crop is substantially equivalent to its conventional counterpart. On the animal side, there is a mandatory pre-market approval process currently for genetically engineered animals. That's under the new animal drug provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And I don't want to go into a lot of details about that, but a new animal drug is defined as anything that alters the structure or function of an animal. And if you add a gene or you change the genetics of the cell, you are altering the structure of that cell. You're altering the structure of that DNA. And so they've interpreted that. We can argue whether that's a good interpretation or not, but they've interpreted that to say, therefore, that change in the DNA, that adding of that gene, changes the structure or function of that animal, and therefore it's a GMO. Therefore it's a new animal drug that needs to be approved. They also proposed the same treatment for gene-edited animals. They said, if you intentionally change a base pair of the DNA of an animal, you are creating a new animal drug, and therefore it also needs to be regulated. So that is a proposal. It hasn't been finalized. This administration hasn't withdrawn that proposal, but they also haven't endorsed it. They've sort of said, we're looking into this, how we're going to regulate gene-edited products holistically, and they haven't really announced anything, but that's the most recent pronouncement from FDA on this topic. So when I look at those together, and there's another agency, EPA, that regulates, but I'm not going to, certain genetically engineered crops that have pesticides introduced, but I'm not going to cover that today. So when I look at this regulatory system, what observations do I get? Well, it's not particularly science or risk-based, and I'll argue that it either has over-regulation or under-regulation. And my example is, so if I change one base pair of a genetically engineered, of a gene-edited crop, it's a voluntary consultation process. But if I change one base pair of an animal, it's a mandatory pre-market approval process. I find it hard to argue that changing one base pair in two different species could have that varied a risk profile, that one gets a very high level of scrutiny and oversight, and one gets a very low level of scrutiny and oversight. Somewhere along the line, somebody's being over-regulated or somebody's being under-regulated. Similarly, if we compare it to GMOs, in the USDA instance, if I use the gene gun to introduce a gene to stop citrus greening, it's not regulated. If I use agrobacterium to introduce that same gene, so I have the same phenotype and the same genotype, it is regulated. And if I get the same phenotype by deleting and silencing a gene using gene editing, I get the same phenotype and it's not regulated. And so again, somewhere along the line, something's either being over-regulated or under-regulated. So it's hard to argue that this is a science-based, risk-based system. Whatever your view is of whether things should be regulated or not regulated, the system as existing, I think, has lots of flaws in it from that perspective. I also want to point out that it's not related to foreign DNA. In the debate over whether something's a GMO or not, the big always issue is, did we introduce some foreign DNA into it? The US regulatory system plays no role whether it's foreign DNA or not. It's whether it's a plant pest, whether it's a food, you know, there are a lot of other triggers, but the trigger is not whether you added foreign DNA, okay? And so what you have is, and that's why I argue, they're treating GMOs and gene-edited crops the same from a legal perspective. They're using the same laws and the same interpretations of those laws. But when they apply them to the different products, you get different results. So what you'll get is most GMOs get regulated by USDA, but most gene-edited products are not going to get regulated. Not because they've been exempt or found safe, but because they don't use agrobacterium or they don't use a plant pest, whereas GMOs use the plant pest. But if the gene-edited did use a plant pest or they had a plant pest associated with it, it would be regulated. And similarly, most gene-edited animals are regulated with FDA. So you get different results because their legal trigger, any change in the DNA, applies equally for both genetically modified animals and gene-edited animals. So that's why I say that they are treated the same legally and regulatorily, but the outcome may be different when you apply it to the facts. So what's the regulatory situation in other countries? Again, the debate is the light switch on or is the light switch off? So I switched directly to the European Union. Many of you may have heard that was a big issue. There was a court case in front of the European Court of Justice brought by a French NGO that went to a French court, and the French court certified the issue to the European Court of Justice, which said, are gene-edited crops covered by the GMO law, the GMO directive in Europe? And this past July, the European Court of Justice said, yes, they are covered. And what they did, and I want to spend a minute on it because I think it's misunderstood by a lot of people, is what they said was, they pretty much just did a pretty standard interpretation of the law. So a lot of people wrote, a lot of articles were written about this, blamed the European Court of Justice for being anti-science, all this kind of stuff. I don't think they made a science determination. They pretty much applied the law as Parliament interpreted, as they interpreted the law of Parliament. If there's a critique of this decision, the critique is that Parliament wrote a law that was overly broad and that should be revisited for this technology, not that the European Court of Justice got it radically wrong. But what the Court of Justice did was, so a GMO under the directive is an organism in which the genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally by mating or natural recombination. So that's the definition. And under that definition, things like mutagenesis are included as GMOs under that law. But they're exempt from the requirements of that law if they don't involve the use of recombinant DNA molecules or GMOs. So the concept is chemical mutagenesis or irradiation. They do produce a GMO under the definition, but they're exempt because they don't use recombinant DNA. And what the European Court of Justice said that in the law that Parliament passed, Parliament said the reason they did that was these other techniques have been conventionally used in a number of applications and have a long safety record. So that was a finding of fact from the European Parliament. And so then the European Court of Justice said, well, then that only really covers conventional mutagenic techniques with a long history of safety. And CRISPR is a new technique without that long history of safety, so it doesn't qualify for what they meant that exclusion to include. So, we can argue about what should be their proper role, but I think the court wasn't so out of base, and I did a blog post that you're welcome to if you want to read more about that detail. They are not the only court that's done that. So New Zealand has a law about GMOs, their Hazardous Substance and New Organism Act, and there a GMO is defined as any organism in which any of the genes or other genetic material has been modified by in vitro techniques. So it's pretty hard to argue that gene editing is not an in vitro technique, okay? And it's modifying DNA, and to some extent, that's what the court concluded. It said that on this basis, the zinc finger 1 techniques are most similar to pure genetic modification, and therefore are covered under the law. So they went back to this definition. And again, we can argue that that should be the definition of a GMO or a definition for any genetically altered kind of organism, but that's what they were doing. So we have, in the international context, several countries whose laws have been interpreted to include gene editing as a GMO. We also have countries like Argentina, which to a large extent has said we're going to look at this on a case-by-case basis. But when you go through their analysis, and this may be a little hard to read, but what they're saying is if you've done a gene-edited crop, you do an early consultation with the Biosafety Committee, and they're going to ask you, is there a new combination of genetic material involved in it? And if it is, then they say, yes, it's a GMO. If it's not, then they're going to ask, well, did you use a transgene, and is there a transgene in the final product? And if there's no transgene in the final product, and no new DNA in the final product, then it's not going to be covered. And so pretty much what their trigger is there foreign DNA or not? If there's no foreign DNA in the final product, even if there is an intermediary product, then it's not going to be regulated as a GMO. And you go through an assessment to come at that. So that's what they've done in several other South American countries. Brazil and others are following that lead. We have countries like Israel that also have a similar regulatory system where they're saying as long as there aren't foreign DNA sequences in it, then it's not being regulated. But you and I can also sit and have a discussion about whether that's really a good scientific trigger. Maybe a good way to deal with the regulatory situation. But isn't all DNA to some extent? And we have genes from other species in us, and they have species, other species have genes in them from other places. And so, what is foreign to some extent? We could have a real good esoteric discussion about that. Countries like Japan, not made a decision yet, but a government committee has said that certain forms of gene editing, again, most of the time when we hear that, it means single base pair deletions, but not those more complex things, might not be regulated. The United Kingdom, interestingly, when they were asked about gene editing, they argued to the European community that if the changes in the DNA could have occurred naturally or through traditional breeding, then they would not be that if it was during that if it was similar to what occurred naturally through traditional breeding, such as a single point mutation, then it shouldn't be regulated as a GMO. That's what they argued scientifically. But they also said when they were leaving Brexit that they would incorporate the GMO laws of the European Union into the new UK laws, because they didn't want to upset trade with the EU, and they wanted to say that they weren't reducing their food safety laws and their environmental laws to their citizens. And so now they're in a quandary, because with the European Court of Decision, they said that they're going to follow the GMO law, and that the GMO law says that gene edited crops are now GMOs. We'll see where that ends up. And then you have other countries that I don't think have even gotten to make a decision yet, but if you look at their definitions, you have the Philippines saying a GMO is any novel combination of genetic material obtained through modern biotechnology. That, as a lawyer, open to lots of interpretation. Ghana says an organism that has had its own genes modified without the insertion of any new genes and their products. Hard to argue under that definition that gene editing isn't included. Okay, if it says any genes modified and you don't even have to add anything to do it, just the fact that it's been modified covers it. And then we have the international agreement in this area, the Cartagena Biosafety Protocol, which says that modern biotechnology is in vitro nucleic acid techniques. I think gene editing qualifies as an in vitro nucleic acid technique. The question becomes, does it overcome natural physical, reproductive, or recombination barriers, and are not techniques used in traditional breeding? It clearly is not one used in traditional breeding, but it produces things similar to traditional breeding. How does that get interpreted? Unclear in my mind as a lawyer. So that's why I said the regulatory situation, I think, overall is unclear around the world. There's still many decisions to be made, and even in the countries that we think are clear, there's still not, I think, the final word on those things. So what are some observations on a possible way forward for this? So I think when you look at this, the government and stakeholders, when they talk about regulation, they discuss gene-edited agricultural products, whether things are regulated based on sort of three triggers. They ask whether there's foreign DNA or transgene in the final product, whether the edit in the product is or could have been found in nature, or whether the edit could have been produced through conventional or traditional breeding, including chemical mutagenesis or irradiation. I'm not sure any of those triggers actually hold up as a scientific matter. They may hold up as a legal matter, but I'm not sure they really hold up. And as a lawyer, I don't know if we've defined things like foreign DNA or found in nature or conventional or traditional to know what the boundaries of those things are. But that is where the debate is going, and that leads to this question of whether that's on or off. I don't think, my personal view is that a binary option is a high-risk game, because the likelihood of 180 countries all turning the light switch off is near zero. And once you have a few countries turning it on, then you run into trade issues and other issues that I'll talk about in a minute. And so, and when the light switch gets on, you get this whole level of oversight that probably isn't relevant and isn't related to the risk profile of the gene-edited crops. So you're trying to push gene editing into two different options, neither of which fits well into gene editing. And so you're pushing square pegs into round holes, and you're making a binary decision, and I just think that's going to end up in a bad situation overall if you continue to do that. Interestingly, Bill Gates had an article in a journal a while ago where he talked about about gene editing, and one of the things he said, which I liked about it was, rules developed decades ago for other forms of genetic engineering don't necessarily fit. I think that is the key here, that we're trying to fit something that doesn't fit, and we're doing that in a very risky way. So my idea is we need to broaden that discussion between beyond those two options. Regulation can take many forms, and we have many different kinds of gene editing. We have a silence gene versus 12 silence genes to produce a metabolic pathway, versus adding DNA versus from one species, from different species. And so we want more of a science-based risk system that has a number of different buckets where we can have different categories for different types of products. And so the questions we should be asking are, what are the potential risks, if anything, from the process? What are the potential risks, if anything, from the products made using that process? How does that risk profile compare to other agricultural breeding techniques and products? And then if there are risks that need regulation, what system would be proportionate to those risks? And set up a system based on those potential risks for those categories of products. That's not what's going on. Interestingly, Bloomberg had an editorial that I really liked. I didn't tell them about this, but it sort of said the same thing, sort of saying a better approach then is a middle course. Rather than prejudge the products of biotechnology, regulators should screen them and single out those that might need special monitoring or restrictions. The idea that we should have a mandatory system, but we should, and that it would help smooth the way, but that it wouldn't be either of the systems we have currently. So that's why I go for this proportionate risk-based system. And I'll leave you with this sort of example. And this is, my basis for this is, okay, so we have 3 different products. All 3 of these products are in the pipeline. I can't tell you if they will make it out to the market or not. But here we have one, gene-edited cold storage potato. Calyx is using TALENS, and they've inactivated a single gene. So they've silenced a single gene to produce this cold storage potato. We also have another biotech company that has turned off 3 genes to make a hypoallergenic peanut, okay, to reduce the allergenicity of peanuts. And we have a third institute, this one in Spain, that's used CRISPR to delete 35 different genes. So they've silenced 35 different genes, and they're making a gluten-reduced wheat. So the question is, do these 3 things have the same level of risk? Do they deserve the same level of oversight? I don't think they do. This one, I may have no problem with. Maybe this gets no oversight. No need for a risk assessment, no need to have any government oversight, maybe just a registry of what's happening. Here, my food safety hat comes on and says, do I really want to trust this company that this is allergen-free, or do I want the government checking and making sure before that gets out there that that's an allergen-free peanut and it's not going to cause people to go to the hospital with an allergen illness? And this one, again, do I worry about the food safety issue? And if we're starting with 35 genes, are there any other things that have happened because we've done so many changes in the genome that we want somebody checking that out? So my view is these 3 things get 3 different levels of oversight. They don't get the same, but the system that's being proposed would either treat all of these as no oversight whatsoever, or all of them as GMOs. And I think that's where the system, that's where I think the things are going wrong. So I put this final quote to that bioinnovation report that sort of talks about this idea that we want appropriate regulation, proportionate oversight, actually helps developers bring products to market, and an independent safety assessment gives consumers trust. If we have an overly stringent one with costly regulation, that prevents things from going to the marketplace and can cause, and if there's no oversight, consumers question the safety. So we've got to figure out that balance in this situation. If there is no federal regulation, what might happen? We could have state oversight. There are states that could regulate genetically engineered crops. I'm sure they could regulate gene-edited crops. So we could have some states, California, Minnesota, others, begin to regulate this. Is that better, having different states doing things than having a uniform federal system? We clearly will have other countries, because I can guarantee you that not everybody's going to do it. So what will be the trade impacts of that? We still need some level of harmonization. And do we want the fact that China, so say we don't regulate it here, and China regulates it, are our farmers then beholden before China approves it? Do they get to grow it? One of the good things about regulation of GMOs that people don't always talk about is when we regulate it here, a lot of countries defer to our regulation. So Korea and Japan and others look at our risk assessments and say, we don't need to do a second one. But if we're not doing anything, who are they going to rely upon? And if they don't agree with us that it needs no regulation, then they may rely upon China or the EU. And do we want that? Or would we rather be the leaders setting what is the level of oversight that goes on? So I'll leave you with that. I want to talk a little bit about consumer acceptance. I think what consumers care the most about is an assurance of safety, transparency, and beneficial products. So what have different stakeholders been saying? As you might imagine, a lot of the NGOs have said, this is genetic engineering 2.0. They said that this is being promoted the same way, that they're saying it's the same using dependence on toxic chemicals, even though that's not the case. And so they are calling for regulation and calling for people not to eat products like this. The National Organic Standards Board voted in 2016 to make a recommendation to USDA that gene editing be an excluded method similar to genetic engineering. That has not been accepted yet by the administration, so it's not part of the organic standard, but you can see where they're going. And you have the non-GMO project pretty much saying these are GMOs and we're not going to include them. And here's their Twitter: don't be fooled, products from new tech like gene editing symbiote are GMOs. So either way, whether there's regulation or not, and whether there's consumer acceptance or not, there's going to be a differentiation in the marketplace. That's already happening. You already see that with some products, the non-GMO project, the organic community. And to some extent, many consumers may not understand these legal scientific distinctions. When you start explaining to them gene editing, the extent that somebody knows about genetic engineering, and I'm not saying many consumers know, it's going to be very hard to make that distinction. And is the foreign gene distinction may be important for regulation? Whether that will be as important to consumer acceptance is I think, an open question. So, to me, the factors for consumer acceptance are: has it been found safe by an independent party? These are the questions that consumers are going to ask. Has it been found safe by an independent party? Are there benefits, and who benefits? Does it fit into their view of food, nutrition, sustainability? And what do influential people they respect say? Those are the kinds of things that I think they're going to ask. I'm not saying that those aren't easy to answer. I think that there will be many consumers who will accept gene-edited products. But I do think that there's going to be some discussion about it at some point. On the issue of transparency, I think one of the things we've learned is if something's hidden from consumers, they wonder why. If it's hidden, is there some reason it's hidden? And for consumers who want to know, which I think is a very small segment of the population, the information needs to be available. So if there's no regulation, how will the food chain and consumers know when these products are commercialized? My thought is we need a national register. So if it's non-browning mushroom is out there, a supermarket chain like Wegmans can go look and say, there are non-browning mushrooms out there if the consumer asks or something like that. So I don't look at transparency as labeling, but I do look at it as the ability to know what's out there and so forth. One other thing that I think will impact consumer acceptance in this area is what I call the wild card, which is CRISPR and gene editing is going to be used in human genome editing and in gene drives in conservation areas. And how is that going to affect consumers? Is that going to make them more likely to be favorable to this or less likely? So you have research being done to correct sickle cell anemia and to address a number of different single point mutation genetic diseases in humans. If they cure sickle cell anemia, that might really give this a boost and might actually help consumers accept this in other fields like agriculture. But we're also using gene drives and things to eradicate rats and mice in places like New Zealand, to end malaria. If this works, again, that may pave the way to acceptance. If it doesn't work, or if we start creating designer babies or other things, it could backfire and could go the other way. So I think that's something, a wild card here that people forget about, that as opposed to GMOs, which has really been a debate only in agriculture, I think there are ethical issues and a lot of other issues on these other aspects of gene editing that are going to overflow into the agricultural debate, from at least the public's perception of it. And one of the interesting things, which I'll leave you with, I'm not going to go through this whole quote, but Commissioner Gottlieb at USDA was talking about gene editing and talking about regulation of it, and pretty much was saying, I, being the commissioner, I'm in charge of both human drug therapies as well as animal drug therapies. And if I say that I don't regulate a single base pair change in an animal, do I do the same thing for humans, which would be the methods for solving sickle cell anemia? And how do I make the science that gene editing done in animals isn't subject to different laws of nature than when these same tools are applied to people? And I've never heard anybody in the administration make this argument before, but it again makes you think about the bleeding over of these different areas, and that while we may want a certain precedent in agriculture, we also have to worry that those precedents, how do those precedents apply in the conservation, or how do they apply in the human area? And I'm not saying that with a bias one way or the other, just a point to keep in mind that that is something that's in the minds of people on this issue. So what are my conclusions? I think regulation should be based on science and risk. I think the regulatory situation right now internationally is uncertain. That I think the existing laws are having trouble keeping up with the science. I think I've probably been saying that for the last 30 years. I think we'll probably say for the next 30 years, and that's not unique to biotech. That there's going to be market segmentation because some consumers will not want gene-edited products, whether no matter how beneficial they are and so forth. That's going to be a reality. It may be a small portion. And how these techniques are used and what products are developed will impact consumer acceptance. I still think in the end, if it's a benefit for consumers, consumers adopt benefits very quickly. The question is, what's the benefit for consumers? But if there's a benefit out there that consumers perceive as a benefit, it will fly off the shelf and nobody's going to care about whether it's gene edited, genetically modified, or anything. The problem is, to date, a lot of this stuff is more benefit to the environment or the farmers or others. And I think in the end, transparency is going to be crucial all around. I think we've learned in this internet age that we're in this immediate access to information age, that without transparency, people are always going to question why, and that's just going to automatically make you start an uphill battle that you don't need to have. So I'm going to end there. I'm happy to answer questions, and if I don't answer them, please feel free to email me, and I'll try to answer them at some later time. Thanks.
And then we'll move to Geneva and see if there are any questions there. Start, Tommy.
So Greg, all of the examples that you gave in various countries were really based on the process, not the product. But Canada has, at least used to have, one really based on the product for GM plants. Has that argument of looking at the product, not the process, that has been overwhelmed and not really in contention for how to base decisions on regulatory issues?
So I'll answer that two ways. First of all, the Canadian system is right. It's based on novelty. And so I would think it would treat gene editing crops the same as a GMO crop. If it's novel, but the product is novel, then it would be regulated. If it's not novel in their definition of novel, it wouldn't be regulated. So I think they would treat GM and gene editing the same. While the Canadian system is, people argue, product-based, if I had a Venn diagram, I'm not aware of them ever taking a GMO and saying it's not novel. It doesn't get regulated. So when you look at what they've regulated under that law, you took a Venn diagram of everything. Everything that's been GMO has been regulated, and one or two other things that are not GMO have been regulated. So although it's a product-based system, it's hard to argue that it really is independent of process because they've never exempted anything from it that's a GMO. So that's just a side on it. My own take is that the product process distinction, to some extent, isn't really a good one because while we need to look at both. If you're doing a risk assessment, you don't just look at the product, you also look at the process that made that product. That informs the process, the product, how you do a risk assessment of that product. So, as my example before of the citrus screening, if you use CRISPR and you don't add a gene that produces a protein, you don't need to do a food safety analysis. But if you use, if you made a citrus greening one and you do introduce a gene from peanuts, then you have a food safety issue to look at. So that process, it's not just the phenotype at the end, you need to look at that genotype in addition, and that does involve some process associated with it. So my regulatory system would have a combination of the product and the process. It's not one or the other solely.
Any questions from Geneva? All right, we'll check back with you in a few minutes. Anyone else have any questions here?
Just a comment, maybe you can respond to. It seems like the whole argument about this light switch is focused on process, sort of predicated on this human instinct to treat anything that's not natural with suspicion, or that's not well established or conventional with suspicion. We have sort of this aversion to new things, right? Because we're just not sure if they're safe. And to me, that also is sort of linked to, in a sense, religion, right? That if it's natural, it's God-given bounty, it's healthy, it's safe for us, right? And if we somehow manipulate it, it isn't. So, is there a way to sway public opinion if it's so deeply grounded in that sort of, human instinct? Because everybody in this room knows that a breeder in a few generations could produce, a toxic sweet potato, right? Through conventional means, natural, breeding and this kind of stuff. And that nature is full of all kinds of horrible and dangerous things. So, I mean, is there? I think so much of the focus on the process, right? And the novelty of the process, the risk inherent in the process, comes from this deeply ingrained sort of part of human nature that has an aversion to the unknown. Right? So, is there any chance of actually moving something more rational?
So on one point, I agree with you. I mean, I sort of agree. In some ways, I agree with you. Clearly, we live with the concept of things that are familiar to us, we're comfortable with, and things that are new or different, we're less comfortable with. And we always look at those with some degree of skepticism, and whether that's natural, unnatural, or that kind of thing. And so things that are novel and new, we raise a hand. Going back to your little 2-year-old, when you want to give them something, their usual 2-year-olds always say no. They always change their mind and say yes later, but their initial reaction is to say no because they don't know at that day, and they don't want to be on the safe side. And so human nature, I think, is initially to say no to those things. And so we do regulate things that are just novel and new because they're novel and new, and eventually we hope that they become familiar and there's no need to regulate them. And part of that is just for consumer confidence and to let people feel comfortable with something because they don't know about it. How do you change that? I mean, part of it at the agricultural field, I think, is making people more aware of, how agriculture, how food gets to their table, where it comes from. So one of the examples I give when I talk about what is natural, and a talk I give is give them an example of fluon, a cross between an apricot and a plum, which is a total human invention. They can't cross that sexually naturally, but it looks, you pick it from a tree. It looks as natural as can be. It's a piece of fruit. It came from a tree, it came from the ground, sun was on it, water, not much else. And yet you and I know that it's the farthest thing from natural, whatever natural means. So hopefully with education, people can begin to realize that there isn't this, while their instinct is this big dichotomy or this big break between something being natural and not natural. The reality is in the biological world, that distinction doesn't exist and everything is a continuum, and therefore to feel more comfortable with things. But I think you're always going to have a hesitation with anything that's new, whether it's biological or other kinds of things, unless there's a major benefit. So cell phones, everybody jumped to, even though it was new, because it has such a great benefit to that. But I go back to pasteurization, which was a new technique that took a long time to be accepted by a lot of people because it was unnatural. Eating milk was unnatural, yet it had huge safety benefits to people, and eventually it became the norm. So the hope is that we can make some of these become the norm. What was, what 40 years ago was novel and new today is considered, mainstream. So I do think the public does change over time. The bar, they move out that far, but it takes time.
Okay, we're at time. Let's just hear some questions and then we'll have Greg give one grand response. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the very wonderful presentation. But my question is about how you put it in context. The countries are actually trying to establish policy frameworks to regulate GMOs. Because how in the presentation you only make an analysis on the assessment. They already established frameworks around the world, the GMOs and how will they operate in TE. But there are countries, for example, in Africa, where we have not actually legislated or put in place measures of medical. I mean, I'm talking about the switch of no GMO or GMO. How would you make sure that at policy levels, countries where people actually would like to have the benefits of the application of both technologies, GM and TP, I mean, put into consideration in ensuring that there are laws and regulatory frameworks in place in those countries?
You want to put your question out?
Sure. In reference to what you were just saying prior, that I understand the public's hesitation with this. Science hasn't always got this right. I mean, we can come up with volumes of times when we did the best we could, but science is not always. We come up with products and they're not always beneficial. From thalidomide, I mean, you can come up with hundreds and hundreds of examples where we did the best we could at the time, but there were unknown unknowns. And I think that speaks more to why are we scared of some of this stuff? It's because, well, it hasn't always worked perfect. And so we do need some regulation. And it's not just religion or scared of science necessarily, but every once in a great while, we don't get it right.
Before you address the questions, I want to check in with Geneva again. Are there any questions in Geneva?
No questions. Thanks for asking.
Okay, thanks.
So to go with the second question first, you're right, we have gotten some things wrong. I think the public is willing to accept mistakes when things are transparent and people, they understand that science will not be 100% correct all the time. When some of the examples that one might give where it's really hurt the public is when things have been hidden, or people didn't acknowledge some of those uncertainties, or when things were found to be problematic, they didn't release that information, they held it back and things like that. And that's where the public really becomes very, very concerned about things in the future. So that's why I think the transparency aspect is so key and critical to this, because I think my view is a regulator or the scientists can get it wrong, but if they were upfront about things, the public will forgive that. But if they weren't upfront about it, then they won't forgive it, and it becomes a lasting kind of thing. That's my own view on it, but that's obviously up for debate. For Africa and for other countries, if you don't have a regulatory system in place, so I think the ones I pointed out, most of those laws and most of those definitions were done before gene editing even existed. So now we're sort of applying an old law to a new technique, and we're getting gaps and ambiguities and not good fixes. And nobody thought about when they made those definitions that there would be this new technique. If you're doing a law now, I think you have to consider your definition, and you can now understand these other techniques and decide to include them or not. So now you're going to make a conscious decision whether to do that. So I think that's the difference. But you also have to realize in those countries that 10 years from now, there's going to be something else new and different. So you have to, you're never going to be able to predict what that is, but you don't want to write your language in such a way that you would unnecessarily capture things that you might not want to capture in the future. So you have to have some flexibility built into that system. Some of these definitions are pretty inflexible. There are countries that write a definition, but they allow the regulator to exempt things and modify things through regulation moving forward as techniques become more conventional as people become more comfortable. As you know, a good regulatory system should put itself out of business if after a while it's finding that everything is safe. It should be able to deregulate those and do that deregulation without having to go back to a parliament or Congress to do that. So there are ways you can do it. Hopefully we learn and we do better jobs as we move forward.
Thank you, Greg. You have fun.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.